Captain Sarah Martinez had been serving at Forward Operating Base Thunder for 8 months when the incident that would change everything began on a scorching Tuesday morning in Afghanistan. The 29-year-old intelligence officer had earned respect through her meticulous analysis and unwavering dedication to protecting her fellow soldiers. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often led newcomers to underestimate her, but those who served alongside her knew better. The base housed approximately 2,000 personnel from various military branches, all working together in the harsh terrain near the Pakistani border. Sarah's unit, the 47th Intelligence Battalion, was responsible for gathering and analyzing critical information about enemy movements in the region. Her team of 12 analysts worked around the clock, processing satellite imagery, intercepting communications, and coordinating with local informants to keep American forces one step ahead of insurgent activities. That morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at the intelligence center at 0500 hours, 30 minutes before her official shift began. She preferred the quiet, early morning hours when she could review overnight reports without interruption. The center buzzed with activity, even at this early hour, with night shift personnel preparing their handover briefings. Computer screens glowed in the dimly lit room, displaying maps, surveillance footage, and encrypted communications that painted a complex picture of the tactical situation. As Sarah settled at her workstation with a cup of coffee, something in the overnight intelligence reports caught her attention. Unusual radio chatter had been intercepted from a sector that had been quiet for weeks. The communications were fragmented and heavily coded, but certain patterns emerged that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Vehicle movements, supply transfers, and personnel discussions suggested something significant was being planned. She spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing the intercepted communications with recent surveillance data and historical patterns in the area. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. The evidence pointed to a coordinated attack being planned against multiple coalition positions, including their own base. The scale and sophistication of the planned operation exceeded anything they had encountered in the region. Sarah immediately began preparing a comprehensive threat assessment. She compiled satellite imagery showing unusual activity at known insurgent compounds, analyzed communication patterns that indicated increased coordination between previously separate cells, and identified supply routes that were being used to move weapons and personnel into position. The intelligence painted a clear picture of an imminent and devastating attack. By 800 hours, she had prepared a detailed briefing packet and requested an immediate meeting with her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison. Harrison was a career officer with 22 years of service, known for his methodical approach and respect for proper channels. When Sarah entered his office, she found him reviewing routine morning reports while eating breakfast at his desk. Sarah presented her findings with the precision and clarity that had made her reputation. She explained the intercepted communications, showed the satellite evidence, and outlined her assessment of the threat timeline. According to her analysis, the attack would likely commence within 72 hours, targeting multiple positions simultaneously to maximize damage and prevent coordinated response. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific pieces of evidence. When Sarah finished her presentation, he leaned back in his chair and considered the information. After several minutes of silence, he shook his head slowly. The response shocked Sarah. Harrison explained that the intelligence was too fragmented to justify the kind of response she was recommending. He pointed out that previous reports of similar activity had proven to be false alarms, and that overreacting to incomplete intelligence could disrupt ongoing operations and create unnecessary panic among the troops. He acknowledged her dedication but suggested she continue monitoring the situation and report back if more concrete evidence emerged. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized her warnings were being dismissed. She attempted to explain the urgency again, emphasizing the patterns she had identified and the historical context that made this threat assessment different from previous false alarms. She requested permission to brief the base commander directly, arguing that the potential consequences of inaction far outweighed the risks of taking precautionary measures. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's response was firm and final. He ordered her to continue her regular duties and to route any future intelligence through proper channels. He reminded her that intelligence analysis was just one piece of the decision-making process, and that operational commanders had access to information and considerations beyond her scope of responsibility. Frustrated but not defeated, Sarah returned to her workstation determined to gather additional evidence. Over the next several hours, she worked frantically to find the concrete proof that would validate her assessment. She reached out to contacts in other intelligence units, cross-referenced her findings with reports from neighboring bases, and analyzed every piece of available data with renewed intensity. As the day progressed, additional intercepts continued to support her original assessment. Radio traffic increased in frequency and urgency, satellite imagery showed continued unusual activity, and reports from local sources began to corroborate the threat she had identified. By afternoon, Sarah was more convinced than ever that a major attack was imminent. She prepared an updated briefing with the new evidence and requested another meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. This time, she brought along Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, her most experienced analyst, who had independently reached similar conclusions based on the same intelligence. They presented their case methodically, addressing each of the concerns Harrison had raised earlier. The lieutenant colonel's response was more dismissive than before. He questioned Sarah's judgment and suggested that her analysis was influenced by stress and inexperience with the complex nature of intelligence work in a combat environment. He reminded her that false alarms had consequences, including the potential to expose intelligence sources and methods, disrupt ongoing operations, and create panic that could compromise mission effectiveness. What happened next would haunt Sarah for months to come. Harrison not only dismissed her intelligence assessment, but also relieved her of her primary analytical duties. He reassigned her to administrative tasks, effectively removing her from the intelligence process. The message was clear. Her persistence had been interpreted as insubordination, and she was being punished for refusing to accept his initial dismissal of her concerns. Sarah felt devastated as she cleaned out her workstation and moved to a desk in the administrative section. 8 months of building credibility and proving her worth seemed to evaporate in a single afternoon. Her colleagues watched with a mixture of sympathy and concern, understanding that challenging a commanding officer's decision, regardless of the merits, carried significant professional risks. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, reviewing the intelligence one final time. Every piece of evidence still pointed to the same conclusion. Her professional instincts, honed through years of training and months of experience in theater, told her that hundreds of American lives were at risk. Yet she had been pushed aside, her warnings dismissed, and her credibility destroyed. As she prepared for what might be her last night at Forward Operating Base Thunder, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would find a way to get her intelligence to someone who would listen, regardless of the personal consequences. The lives of her fellow soldiers were worth more than her career, and she was willing to sacrifice everything to protect them. The next morning would bring validation in the most dramatic way possible. But for now, Sarah could only wait and hope that she was wrong about the impending attack. The weight of her knowledge pressed down on her as she tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would either vindicate her assessment or end her military career in disgrace. The attack began at 0347 hours, exactly as Sarah had predicted. The first indication was the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars, followed by the thunderous explosions that shook the entire base. Sarah was instantly awake in her quarters, her training taking over as she grabbed her gear and headed for the designated shelter area. Even as she ran through the chaos, her mind was calculating the timing and coordination of the assault, confirming every detail of her dismissed intelligence assessment. The insurgents had planned their attack with devastating precision. Multiple positions around the base perimeter erupted in gunfire simultaneously, indicating the level of coordination Sarah had warned about. The communications she had intercepted proved accurate as enemy fighters struck from positions she had identified in her satellite analysis. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices detonated at key entry points, while coordinated small arms fire pinned down responding forces. Within the first 30 minutes of the attack, it became clear that this was unlike anything the base had experienced before. The insurgents demonstrated detailed knowledge of defensive positions, guard rotations, and vulnerable points in the perimeter. They targeted communication facilities, ammunition storage areas, and command centers with precision that spoke to extensive surveillance and planning. The attack Sarah had predicted was unfolding exactly as she had warned it would. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself in the command bunker, coordinating the defense while trying to understand how the enemy had achieved such tactical surprise. Radio reports poured in from around the perimeter, painting a picture of a well-coordinated assault that seemed to anticipate every defensive measure. As the scope of the attack became apparent, Harrison began to remember Sarah's warnings with growing dread. The base defense held, but barely. American forces fought heroically against overwhelming odds, using superior training and firepower to prevent the insurgents from breaching the inner perimeter. Medical teams worked frantically to treat the wounded while ammunition supplies dwindled under the sustained assault. By dawn, the attackers had withdrawn, leaving behind significant damage and 17 American casualties. In the aftermath of the battle, the base settled into an uneasy quiet. Damage assessment teams surveyed the destruction while medical personnel continued treating the wounded. The successful defense had prevented catastrophic losses, but the cost was significant. Equipment was destroyed, facilities damaged, and the psychological impact on personnel was substantial. Most troubling was the realization that the attack could have been much worse if not for some fortunate circumstances that had nothing to do with preparedness. As reports filtered in from other coalition positions, the true scope of the coordinated assault became apparent. 5 bases had been attacked simultaneously using identical tactics and timing. The level of coordination exceeded anything intelligence analysts had previously observed in the region. 3 bases had suffered significant casualties, while 2 others had been forced to evacuate critical personnel under fire. By noon, investigative teams were already working to understand how such a massive coordinated attack had achieved tactical surprise. Communication intercepts from the previous days were being analyzed, satellite imagery was being reviewed, and intelligence reports were being scrutinized for any warnings that might have been missed. The investigation would eventually lead back to Sarah's dismissed intelligence assessment. Meanwhile, Sarah had spent the morning helping with casualty evacuation and damage control. Despite being relegated to administrative duties, her training as an intelligence officer made her invaluable during the crisis response. She worked alongside medics, helped coordinate supply distribution, and assisted with communications as the base struggled to restore normal operations. As the immediate crisis stabilized, word began spreading about the intelligence failure that had preceded the attack. Personnel throughout the base were asking how such a coordinated assault could have achieved complete surprise. Rumors circulated about missed warnings and ignored intelligence reports. Sarah found herself the center of attention as word spread that she had attempted to warn about the attack. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had supported Sarah's original assessment, began sharing details about their dismissed intelligence briefing. Other analysts came forward with pieces of information that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared to be part of the larger pattern Sarah had identified. The picture that emerged was damning. Clear warning signs had been present, properly analyzed, and then dismissed by command authority. By late afternoon, news of the investigation was spreading beyond the base. Higher command levels became aware that intelligence warnings had been dismissed prior to the coordinated attacks. Regional command began demanding explanations for the intelligence failure, particularly given the scope and success of the enemy operation. Questions were being asked about decision-making processes and the handling of threat assessments. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Initial reports from his superiors suggested that heads would roll over the intelligence failure. The successful coordination of multiple simultaneous attacks represented a significant escalation in enemy capability, and someone would be held accountable for the failure to anticipate and prepare for such an operation. As evening approached, Harrison received word that a team of senior investigators would arrive the following morning to conduct a comprehensive review of intelligence procedures and decision-making processes. The message was clear. This incident would not be swept aside or handled through routine channels. The scope of the coordinated attacks and the intelligence failure that preceded them demanded answers at the highest levels. The base settled into an uneasy night, with increased security measures and a heightened state of alert. Personnel were exhausted from the battle and its aftermath, but sleep came fitfully for those who remembered Sarah's warnings. The contrast between her accurate assessment and the official dismissal of her intelligence was impossible to ignore. Sarah spent the evening writing a detailed timeline of her intelligence analysis and the command response to her warnings. She documented every piece of evidence she had presented, every meeting she had requested, and every official response she had received. Her military training had taught her the importance of accurate record-keeping, and she sensed that her documentation would soon become crucial evidence. As she worked late into the night, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 48 hours. Her intelligence assessment had proven tragically accurate, but the validation brought no satisfaction. 17 soldiers had been wounded, millions of dollars in equipment had been destroyed, and the enemy had achieved a significant tactical victory. The cost of being right was higher than she had ever imagined it could be. The next morning would bring investigators who would want to understand exactly what had gone wrong with the intelligence process. Sarah's dismissed warnings would become the center of their investigation, and the decisions that had sidelined her would face intense scrutiny. But tonight, as the base struggled to recover from the attack she had predicted, Sarah could only prepare for whatever consequences her accurate analysis would bring. Her career had been damaged by speaking truth to power, but the events of the last day had proven the deadly importance of her work. Tomorrow would determine whether the military justice system would vindicate her assessment or punish her for the disruption her warnings had caused. Either way, Sarah Martinez had learned that being right wasn't always enough in the complex world of military intelligence. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the morning air at 0630 hours, exactly 27 hours after the coordinated attack had ended. Sarah watched from her administrative desk as 3 Black Hawks approached the landing zone, their rotors kicking up clouds of dust that obscured the morning sun. The arrival was unprecedented in its urgency and scale, suggesting that the investigation into the intelligence failure had reached the highest levels of military command. As the helicopters touched down, Sarah could see figures in dress uniforms emerging through the dust clouds. The sight sent ripples of tension throughout the base as personnel realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Word spread quickly that senior officers were arriving to investigate the attack and the circumstances that had preceded it. For Sarah, the moment represented either vindication or the end of her military career. The first figure to emerge clearly from the lead helicopter wore the 3 stars of a lieutenant general. Behind him came 2 more generals, their uniforms immaculate despite the dusty conditions. The arrival of 3 general officers at a forward operating base was virtually unprecedented, indicating the seriousness with which higher command was treating the intelligence failure and coordinated attack. Lieutenant General Patricia Hawkins led the investigation team, her reputation for thorough and uncompromising reviews preceding her arrival. With 28 years of service and extensive experience in intelligence operations, she had been personally selected by the Joint Chiefs to investigate the circumstances that had allowed such a significant intelligence failure to occur. Her presence signaled that careers would end and procedures would change. Major General Robert Chen, the second officer to emerge, specialized in operational security and had investigated numerous intelligence failures throughout his career. His role was to examine the decision-making processes that had led to the dismissal of Sarah's warnings and to determine whether systemic problems existed in the command structure at Forward Operating Base Thunder. Brigadier General Maria Santos, the third member of the team, brought expertise in personnel management and military justice. Her presence suggested that individual accountability would be pursued for the decisions that had led to the intelligence failure. Her reputation for fairness was matched by her willingness to hold senior officers accountable when their decisions endangered American lives. The generals were met by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and the base commander, Colonel William Stewart, both of whom appeared visibly nervous about the high-level attention their base was receiving. The formal greetings were brief and professional, but the tension was obvious to everyone watching from a distance. Within minutes, the investigation team had been escorted to the base conference room for initial briefings. Sarah continued her administrative duties while watching the arrival through the window, aware that her role in the unfolding drama was far from over. By mid-morning, she received word that she was to report to the conference room at 1400 hours for questioning. The message came through official channels, indicating that her interview would be part of the formal investigation rather than an informal discussion. As news of the general's arrival spread throughout the base, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Personnel went about their duties with unusual quiet, aware that the investigation could result in significant changes to command structure and procedures. The successful enemy attack had been bad enough, but the revelation that warnings had been dismissed made the situation exponentially worse. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison spent the morning in increasingly uncomfortable meetings with the investigation team. His decisions regarding Sarah's intelligence assessment were being scrutinized in minute detail, with particular attention paid to his rationale for dismissing her warnings and removing her from analytical duties. The general's questions were pointed and professional, but the implications were clear. By noon, word had spread that the investigation team had requested copies of all intelligence reports, communication logs, and decision documents from the 72 hours preceding the attack. Sarah's original briefing materials were among the first documents requested, along with records of her meetings with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and the subsequent reassignment orders. When Sarah reported to the conference room at the appointed time, she found herself facing the three generals across a polished wooden table. The setting was formal and intimidating, but Sarah drew confidence from knowing that her analysis had been correct and thoroughly documented. She had prepared for this moment by reviewing every detail of her intelligence assessment and the command response to her warnings. Lieutenant General Hawkins conducted the interview with professional precision, beginning with Sarah's background and qualifications before moving to the specific intelligence analysis that had preceded the attack. Sarah presented her findings clearly and methodically, explaining the patterns she had identified and the assessment process that had led to her warnings about the coordinated assault. The generals listened intently as Sarah described her meetings with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and his dismissal of her intelligence assessment. She provided detailed documentation of her evidence, the briefing material she had prepared, and the official responses she had received. Her testimony was factual and professional, avoiding personal criticism while clearly establishing the timeline of events. Major General Chen asked pointed questions about the intelligence gathering process and the methods Sarah had used to reach her conclusions. His queries were designed to test the validity of her analysis and to determine whether her warnings had been based on solid intelligence or speculation. Sarah's responses demonstrated the thoroughness of her work and the accuracy of her assessment methods. Brigadier General Santos focused on the command response to Sarah's warnings and the decision-making process that had led to her reassignment. Her questions explored whether proper procedures had been followed and whether Sarah's concerns had received appropriate consideration. The answers painted a clear picture of intelligence being dismissed without adequate investigation. The interview lasted 3 hours, during which Sarah provided comprehensive testimony about her intelligence analysis and the command response to her warnings. By the end of the session, it was clear that her original assessment had been thorough, accurate, and properly presented through appropriate channels. The failure lay not in her analysis, but in the command decision to dismiss her warnings. As Sarah left the conference room, she encountered Lieutenant Colonel Harrison waiting in the hallway. His appearance suggested that his own interview had not gone well, and the strain of the investigation was showing in his demeanor. Their brief exchange was professional but tense, with both understanding that the investigation would likely end at least one of their careers. That evening, the investigation team worked late into the night, reviewing documents and preparing their preliminary findings. Base personnel watched the lights burning in the conference room, knowing that decisions were being made that would reshape the command structure and potentially end military careers. The next morning brought swift and decisive action. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was relieved of his duties pending further investigation and potential court-martial proceedings. His dismissal of critical intelligence warnings, despite clear evidence of an imminent threat, constituted a failure of command responsibility that had endangered American lives. Sarah received word that she was being immediately restored to her analytical duties and would be transferred to a new position at Regional Intelligence Headquarters. Her accurate assessment and persistent efforts to warn about the attack had been vindicated at the highest levels. More importantly, new procedures were being implemented to ensure that intelligence warnings would receive proper consideration regardless of their source. The investigation's final report would eventually cite systemic failures in the intelligence review process and recommend significant changes to command procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's career ended in disgrace, while Sarah's reputation was rehabilitated and her career prospects enhanced. The price of validation had been 17 wounded soldiers and millions of dollars in damage, but the lessons learned would help prevent similar failures in the future. As the generals departed Forward Operating Base Thunder 3 days later, they left behind a transformed command structure and new procedures designed to ensure that critical intelligence would never again be dismissed without proper investigation. Sarah watched their helicopters disappear into the distance, knowing that her courage in speaking truth to power had ultimately prevailed. The system had failed initially, but it had also proven capable of correction when confronted with its mistakes.